Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be here. I met Jeff exactly 40 years ago plus a month, I think. This was 1982, and I had been in Poland doing research on the Solidarity movement. And I was able to get away for a month during martial law. It was very difficult, but they gave me an exit visa and a return visa. And oh, I'm not that tall, huh?
None of us.
In any case, that's when I met Elżbieta and Jeff, because there was all these discussions going on here at the new school. So, and Jeff had just produced this book, on cultural freedom. Of course, I couldn't find my own book, so luckily I had ordered it from the library a long time ago from my library. So got my own copy, which was published just then in 1982, and it's that's the book of Jeff that probably stays most influential to me. Now, because this is a conference for Jeff, I'll do what the others have done, not just talk about him, but try to use his concepts, his categories to try to make sense of current politics. So, you know, I begin with his concepts of cultural freedom in East and West and the different logics which restrain cultural freedom in each. So, of course, he talks about how in market society and capitalist society, cultural freedom is restrained via market principles, right? You can formally publish, say whatever you want, but you don't have access to an audience. You don't have access to the means of reproduction, of production of those. It's difficult to do so. If you can state and show your work, but there's a restraining logic from market principles. In state socialist society, of course, it's via political logic. You're not free to publicize any cultural product you wish. The state presents a culture as binding. And so there are these different restraints. Now, Jeff, to his credit in this work at the time, makes clear that both are very repressive, right? And that both have dire impact on possibilities of cultural freedom. So he doesn't just denounce one and not the other. But then he complicates it, complicates it. On the one hand, there's the irony that market principles might be in some way a more efficient way to restrain opposition. That is, when repression or exclusion is done by market principles, the system can legitimately claim that it's not preventing opposition ideas. It's just that the market, or the limited demand and the limited supply you have on producing that demand, it's just that keeps opposition ideas limited, right? So there's a way in which it can excuse any of its restrictions by saying we're not doing it. So the openly political constraints of state socialism can easily backfire. For example, they give everyone a gripe against the system. He has this wonderful quote here that always reminded me of something I found also in Moscow, where I had been for a while before I was in Poland. And there was a writer complaining about that he couldn't get published, and there was political repression, and then he left the room, and his friends in Russia said, we keep saying he's politically repressed. The problem is he's a bad writer, right? And Jeff has this line here, right? The very existence of the censorship provides for the amateur, the sophomoric, and the just plain mediocre a built-in rationalization that their work is not being published or shown for political reasons, right? So the system just it backfires in that way. It creates all kinds of opposition. But then he also shows, right, how the state socialist system creates opposition. That political logic of repressing cultural freedom creates a certain opposition. Now, any opposition is a challenge to state socialism. And yet the system systematically generates some of that opposition. On the one hand, not at first, he has this discussion of what he calls the agitprop period when state socialism is consolidated. But after that point, right, because that wears off, it's not satisfactory for a durable consolidated system, then it tries to provide more sophisticated cultural products. In a sense, he doesn't use this term, but the term that Paul Piccone was using around the same time was of artificial negativity comes to mind, right? That they're trying to create this opposition artificially in order to legitimate itself. Now, what kind of cultural products does it allow? And Jeff points to two, and I think that's exactly right. On the one hand, there's the literature of the nation, right? The traditional national literature. This is something these systems needed to justify themselves, particularly in Eastern Europe, where they could easily be seen as products of Soviet domination. And so the great literature of the nation is something that is promoted, brought to people's views. And of course, the literature of Marxism, right, with its oppositionist ideals that can be used against the system. In other words, Jeff is really good at showing that the aim of state socialist cultural policy is not just to repress any voice that counters it. That's a standard view, as he points out. It also cannot help but create opposition by giving people the tools with which to criticize the system. Its Enlightenment principles do that. Now, at this point, he discusses the phenomenon of the student theater. That is, not that it's done by students, but that theater groups were promoted by formally non-party organizations associated with the Independent Students Organization, and under that rubric, under that aegis, a lot of different theaters arose. And of course, he discusses that in great detail, and it's really still, I think, to this day, one of the best accounts of those periods. Now, these people promoting that theater, that independent theater, in a sense, support the system, at least in that they do not question it. They work within its boundaries and its restraints. And this was happening in a wide variety of areas. Jeff focuses on student theater. I saw this and in the political opposition, the way someone like Adam Michnik, who Jeff, of course, has been quite close to in the Democracy Seminar and elsewhere, right? As a young student already in 1964, 65, gets acceptance to create this radical Marxist student organization within the University of Warsaw to promote these alternative views, right? But it's also a way to try to win over new people by allowing this kind of opposition. That is, some of the student theater is more likely to produce that reproduce that national culture that state socialism allows, whereas this political opposition opposed the system by reproducing using the Marxist literature. So in this way, you know, the purpose again, the purpose is to legitimate the system among those who resist censorship. That is, to bring the creative intelligentsia on the side of the party. And to do so, they point, both of these tendencies point to the system's flaws. In a sense, he doesn't use this term, but thinking about it, it's a kind of repressive tolerance, as Marcuse once called about it, right? Explicit views of the right are not allowed, and there's a way in which only the national and the Marxist logics are able to appeal. And I think that helps me explain, I know time is of the essence here. There's the right-hand man of Kaczynski, now Richard Terlecki, right, who has this past. He's always trying to gainsay his past as an old hippie, right, as an old cultural oppositionist, right? Now he's a firm Catholic right-winger, but there was no space, right, for that right wing to emerge as a right wing. You could only do it from those points of view. Now, in this way, though, that repressive tolerance and having that opposition from national culture and from Marxist culture promotes a kind of healthy, democratic, socialist clientele, right? And that's the thing that marveled many leftists, including myself at the time, right? How is it that these movements generate opposition that are all formally reproducing some kind of left Marxist logic, even though there's so many right-wingers within it? Well, let's jump to the present now. Of course, the present is a very different situation culturally, and I want to use Jeff's categories to try to decode what's happening at present. And I'm talking here about Kaczynski peace in Poland and Orban's model in Hungary. Now, of course, this is a government and an ideology that rejects liberalism openly, that is hostile to pluralism. At its roots, it's openly authoritarian in that it insists it is right, it represents the nation. Every other view is wrong and is treasonous on the grounds that it does not represent the nation. So why ought it be allowed? Why should it be allowed? And yet there is no direct censorship. And this is right, they're trying to oppose the left, which of course now means any kind of liberalism, but there's no direct censorship. Now it's doing its best to crack down on the existence of that opposition without the censorship. So the difference is that it does not formally repress like the left is. Why allow it at all? On the one hand, we live in such a period internationally that full repression would lead to sanctions, and they are, of course, in the European Union. On the other hand, lacking the Enlightenment instincts of state socialism, it does not necessarily generate an opposition the way state socialism does, because it doesn't claim to control everything. It doesn't need to explicitly allow anything. And that's why, right, today's, the way it tries to restrain opposition and opposition views, opposition culture views, is precisely by market logic. That is, it seeks to police the political realm by market logic, not political logic. Today's right does its best to strip resources from its domestic critics. It allows the opposition its spots of freedom only on the basis of market principles. If they can find a market niche, they can survive. At the same time, it tries to strip the opposition of its small spots via market principles. And so Orban has done this very well in Hungary, having a closely connected oligarch buy up an opposition press and then close it down, taking away also the entire internet archive that goes with it. Peace has done this as well. Recently, about a year ago, it bought out, its state-owned company bought out a whole slew of regional newspapers and of that way have changed and undercut that opposition. And they've tried to do it with the main opposition daily Gazeta Wyborcza for a long time. So it's not that the system is neutral politically. On the contrary, it supports its people. It supports the right, it supports its right-wing group. So it does use political logic here also to imbalance the cultural and political fields. In other words, right, the current arrangement combines market and state principles as ways of repressing liberal culture and politics and promoting this right-wing culture and illiberal politics. And I think this is perhaps its great innovation, right? That perhaps precisely it can do it in both of these ways. It's why these governments can convey and claim with real plausibility not to be anti-democratic, and yet they seem to be able to marginalize opposition and culture and ideas better than state socialism did precisely because of that original point, the way that market principles might be more efficient because they don't boomerang against the repressor the way the political logic of repression boomerangs against the repressor. I have a couple of more notes, but that's a fine place to stop. So thank you.